Hello and welcome to this webinar. This is Dr. Yadolah Zarezadeh from Kurdistan University of Medical Sciences in Sanandaj, Iran. I would like to begin my short presentation with appreciation of your role in healthcare and in controlling the pandemic COVID-19 all over the world wherever you live. I would like to say thank you for attending this webinar. We appreciate that the period of this pandemic has been the time of hardship, limitation, grave sorrow on the one hand, and learning about ourselves and our societies and becoming more resilient and stronger, of course, on the other hand. Let me also thank Professor Zaidi for this webinar because he kindly suggested the topic. As the title of the webinar suggests, we want to talk about some global issues related to the pandemic COVID-19, and we want to reflect on these issues, try to see the unseen aspects of the pandemic, and as the term reflection suggests, learn from what has happened to us as humanity. Today, I will first briefly talk about reflection, its definition, its history in Western and Eastern and contemporary traditions of thinking, and the value of reflection in learning and in redirecting our practices based on that learning and wisdom gained. Then I will mention some pan-COVID issues that I think deserve revisiting, reflecting, and maybe redirecting. Finally, I urge global communities of practice to conduct reflective discussions in different issues related to the pandemic in order to address the unattended duties, dilemmas, and dimensions. Etymologically, reflection stems from the Latin verb reflectere, meaning to bend or to turn back to the self. In English language, to reflect on or to reflect upon something means to think deeply and carefully about that thing. If you look at the word reflection in a dictionary, you will find that reflection is described by other words related to thinking, such as consideration, meditation, carefulness, attention, and understanding. For instance, in Merriam-Webster dictionary, you will find a thought, idea, or opinion formed or a remark made as a result of meditation, or a consideration of some subject matter, idea, and purpose. And in Cambridge Dictionary, reflection is defined as a serious and careful thought. You see, the very meaning of reflection is related to thinking and consideration everywhere. Socrates, the Greek philosopher, is well known for his method of dialogue between teacher and students, in which both are responsible for pushing the dialogue forward through questioning. This method is also acknowledged as the foundation of Western pedagogical tradition. Socrates, who is also acknowledged as the first moral philosopher, advocated getting wisdom through questioning the concepts and reflecting on the basic assumptions. These statements are attributed to him, and they show how important reflection is in his philosophy. Humans must choose a good life for themselves through self-reflection and self-awareness. Humans must understand the nature of knowledge they learn through their life and through others and reflect on it. Humans gain their knowledge through experience and careful reflection. For him, knowing oneself is a life mission. Socrates advised us to never stop to know the self, as a way of life, not just as a statement. Plato, the most famous disciple of Socrates, the founder of academy, the first institution of higher education in Western world, advocated philosophical reflection in his work, including Phaedon. Plato believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. He described the notion of examined life as the life that aims at wisdom, at finding truth about our existence, and achieving a moral balance in our actions. This statement is relevant to us in relation to pandemic COVID-19 because we need to find truth about our life during the pandemic, and we as mankind need to reach a moral balance in our actions. Aristotle describes virtues in two types: the virtue of thought, such as wisdom and farsightedness, and the virtue of character, such as bravery, temperance, and generosity. Reflection is closely related to both types of virtues described by Aristotle. He also drew our attention to the distinction between theory and practice, and maintained that this is reflection that can connect these two. I will later mention Donald Schoen, who described how reflection can help filling the gap between the theory and the practice in professional life. In Western traditions of thinking, reflection has been considered as a way of thinking and doing. After the ancient Greek philosophers, it was John Dewey, the contemporary philosopher and educationalist, and one of the founders of a school of pragmatism, that first advocated using reflection as a tool for understanding and clarifying any thought and assumption. Dewey has defined reflection, and his definition encompasses all aspects of reflection. He writes, "Active, persistent, and careful consideration of any thought or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it, and further conclusions to which it tends." Some scholars, such as Hervet, Van Manen, Morrison, and others, have described three types of human interests. An interest in accurate knowledge to predict and control the environment. This is satisfied by science and is represented in positivism. Here, reflection is used to understand the causal relationships among variables. Second, an interest in understanding the meaning of things, an interest in clarifying, interpreting, and an interest in attaching meaning to everything. This interest is met by hermeneutics and interpretivism, and is represented in qualitative modes of inquiry. And the last interest is an interest in freedom and emancipation, which is fulfilled by critical social science, criticism, considering wider socio-political relationships, justice, ethical stance, and resistance, as you see in the table. Here, reflection is the main tool in questioning and understanding the hidden aspects of every subject matter. Reflection is used to see the unseen issues. So, reflection is a way of learning, changing, and moving forward. Donald Schoen was one of the influential writers whose books has shaped our understanding on reflective practice, especially by introducing two concepts of reflection on action and reflection in action. It's worth mentioning that Schoen did not invent these concepts, rather, he discovered them. He found that professionals reflect after action and during action, and accordingly they change their practice based on what they have learned as the result of their reflections. Reflection in action happens during an action. The professional considers the situation, understands a need for change, decides and fine-tunes the action. But a reflection on action occurs when an issue that has happened. The professional understands, clarifies, learns, and decides what to do next. Reflection for action is another concept which is related to future scenarios. Here, professionals think ahead about future scenarios. consider what is known, rehearse, and become prepared for the future. Up to now, I have tried to introduce reflection as a way of doing and thinking in Western rationality. As you would expect, I have to briefly talk about reflection in Eastern traditions as well. Reflection has long been considered as a way of being and becoming in Eastern traditions. Jones considers reflection as a way of being under the influence of an interpretation of Zen Buddhism from various resources, an interpretation of a Native American medicine, Eastern spiritual schools such as Sufism and some Islamic traditions. Jones concluded that the ancient traditions emphasized that reflection is a spiritual activity pivotal to being and becoming the sort of person the practitioner seeks to be. As you know, the pandemic COVID-19 was announced on March 11, 2020 by WHO. The virus had infected many countries a few months prior to that date, and now we have been living in a pandemic that has lasted for 2 years. In these 2 years, more than 5.4 million deaths have been officially reported to WHO, while the estimations are at least 3 times bigger. We have experienced 5 peaks, many waves, and different variants. Based on what was briefly mentioned about reflection and its value for human being, it's time to reflect. It's time to use our unique weapon, reflection, to understand the very and various aspects of pandemic, its different dimensions, the issues that are ambiguous, complex, unclear, puzzling, and confusing. It's time for us, especially as scholars, academics, and professionals, to ask hard questions. Questions such as, how much of these harms was preventable? Who did not do their duty? Who did it? Did we do what we could and what we were able to do? In what aspects we did well and in what aspects we didn't? And finally, what is to be done? Let's think about some official facts and figures. When we look at WHO COVID-19's dashboard and the databases of different countries, we find counts, figures, percentages, numbers of cases, deaths, vaccination rates, and etc. When you see the differences between official data, for example, on WHO dashboard and in the Economist homepage, you have the right to ask, do we have the right statistics of mortality and morbidity? Do they show the actual data and statistics? In places where there is not a good health infrastructure, how can we trust statistics at all? In the dashboard page of the WHO we read, all counts are subject to variation in case detection, definitions, laboratory testing, vaccination strategy, and reporting strategies. So, when I see the total number of deaths that says 5.4 million people all over the world died, I feel this number needs reflection. Economists read that their own estimation suggested the actual toll exceed 17 millions. The devil is in the details, and we do not know the actual numbers. We should reflect on the impacts of not knowing the actual numbers. This is a matter for reflection because it impacts us. Another issue that needs reflection is moral responsibility. A paper was published in a Scandinavian Journal of Public Health by Professor Jessica Falquist. Regardless the content and the conclusions of the paper, which are important in their place, its title is thought-provoking. The title is the moral responsibility of governments and individuals in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. We need to reflect on our moral responsibilities as scholars, academics, governments, and individuals, because millions of people have died. Much more have been adversely affected, and the course of the pandemic is unclear. We have to learn from what has happened and change the directions if needed. Please look at this figure, which I have borrowed from the website of Economist. As you observe, most COVID-19 vaccines have been used in rich countries. There is a direct relationship between the wealth of the country and the vaccination rate. The questions arise here are: should rich countries have helped poor countries to overcome COVID-19? Is vaccine nationalism ethical? Was it in the interest of the nations whose leaders had a tendency to keep the vaccine just for their own nations? Was it wise or ethical for rich countries to buy more than needed vaccines, while poor countries were not able to access enough vaccines for even one single dose for their populations? Please look at the WHO dashboard to see the vaccination rates in poor and rich countries. Why a universal COVID-19 vaccine mandate is ethical today? This is the title of a paper published in November 2021 by members of a bioethics board. They concluded that both vaccine mandates for COVID-19 were ethically justified. On the contrary, the World Health Organization warns against mandatory vaccine until all other options have been exhausted. So, this is the question for debate and reflection. Is it ethical to refuse getting vaccinated against COVID-19? Reflection can help when there are conflicting rights, concepts, ideologies, and interests. There are conflicting concepts such as harm to others and self if not vaccinated, religious limitations, individual rights, medical exemptions, for example, and all of these are the matters for reflection. Ethical choices in a pandemic. This is a report published by the Swedish National Council on Medical Ethics. This report has provided an overview of the core ethical values, problems, and challenges that are actualized in a pandemic. The report also contains general recommendations and proposals. The topics and the contents of such a work can become subject matters for reflection in academia and elsewhere, especially in the departments of medical ethics. Some contents of the reports are objectives, values, and principles before and during a pandemic, global ethics and international solidarity during the pandemic, ethics and personal contact at the end of life, experimental treatment on victims of the pandemic, research ethics in the time of pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has been contributory in creating a shift from people's need to live in a mutual friendship toward a tendency to stigmatize others. Pandemic triggered othering. At the beginning of the pandemic, in some countries, the feelings toward the Chinese, for example, changed. Some politicians used the pandemic as a weapon against their rivals and other countries. In some countries, people were divided into opposite camps. Even inside countries, communities, and families, people were stigmatized and isolated. So, it's time to ask, what do we learn from these events? Why are these things happen? What are the social and cultural bases for these types of mentalities and behavior? These are things that need reflection. Finally, the issue of physicians' duty to treat during pandemic is a very important issue to be discussed. A very good paper in this regard has been published by David Orentlicher, and the title of the paper is The Physician's Duty to Treat During Pandemics. The paper discusses for and against the duty to care when healthcare professionals and physicians are at considerable risk. I urge everyone to have a look at this paper. Reflection has a long history, as long as the history of thinking and being in both Western and Eastern traditions. We are in the middle of a crisis called pandemic COVID-19, and we have lost millions of people around the world. We feel, as global society, we did not do well regarding controlling the pandemic. We could have done better in many aspects of the management of the pandemic and helping one another as humanity. We must reflect on our collective and individual behavior and decisions in order to be able to work better and to prevent the future pandemics. Thank you.